In this lecture, we'll be examining the war on the Eastern Front. Hitler had strategic and ideological reasons for invading Russia. He knew that the Soviets and the United States were critical to maintaining British will, or their will to fight in the war. He craved the land, agriculture, and raw materials of the Soviets, especially oil. The doctrine of Lebensraum, or living room, he believed the Germans, as the perfect Aryan race, deserved more land. He viewed Russians and Slavs as sources of cheap labor at best, referred to them as Untermenschen, or subhuman. And to Hitler, the Soviet Union was the nest of two of his greatest enemies, the Jews and the Slavs. This quote sums up Hitler's views on Russia. What India was for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union, named after German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded one. Hitler assumed the Soviets were technologically backward, that the German technology was vastly superior, and that he could destroy the Soviets in 1 year. It was critical for him then to catch and destroy the Soviet army at the borders, but Russians had a great deal of territory to trade space for time, and this caused the Nazis major logistical problems. His greatest fear, of course, would be that he would not be able to take the Soviets out in that 1 year time frame, as he believed. In terms of strengths in 1941, the Germans possessed a battle-tested military. The Luftwaffe at the time was the best air force in the world. The Germans seemed to be unstoppable, with the exception of the Battle of Britain. They had been cruising to a series of seemingly endless victories. And Hitler himself was a source of strength for the German army. He was a charismatic figure that many people looked up to. He will also be, in my opinion, a source of weakness for the Germans. Some of the disadvantages the Germans faced in 1941, Soviet rail system was a 15-20 millimeter rail system, whereas the Germans had a 14-35 millimeter system, and they were forced to, well, with several options, none of them were very appealing, to take goods off of one train and put them on another, or to try to retrofit cars to get different rail cars to fit different rail gauges. At this time, the Germans still relied heavily on draft animals for resupply and lacked motorized vehicles for logistical purposes. Initially, they did not send winter uniforms to the troops. Meanwhile, the Germans were fighting on many different fronts. They were in the Balkans, they were in North Africa, they were in France, they were in other occupied areas, had just finished the Battle of Britain. And I'm throwing Hitler both in the category of a strength and weakness for this lecture. In terms of weaknesses, he was headstrong, believed he knew more about the military than his own military leaders, very impulsive, and very quick to fire those who disagreed with him. Soviet strengths in 1941, they had a population nearly 3 times the size of Germany. They had territory 30 times greater than Germany. More access to natural resources, especially oil, and climate proved to be in their favor, as we will see in the winter of 1941 and early 1942. One of the Soviet advantages was the T-34 tank, which at the time was the most effective and efficient tank design of the Second World War, perhaps of the entire war. The Soviets produced over 60,000 T-34s and their variants by 1945. This was a cheap and easy to build tank. It was very easy to operate comparatively, one-stick driving, and you didn't necessarily need a great deal of skill to drive one of these. It was very fast for its day, very highly maneuverable. It had sloped armor, which you can see somewhat on the bottom right-hand picture. that deflected shells. Its diesel engine was less prone to fires than many other competing tanks at the time. It handled cold well. The T-34 could operate in places where the Germans couldn't travel, like muddy areas and swamps. Its 250-mile range was almost double that of the Germans, and its armor could only be penetrated at close range from the rear. Another advantage for the Soviets was the development of the Katyusha rocket launcher. These were very inexpensive and easy to produce. They were not necessarily that accurate, very good at saturation bombing. They were something of a terror weapon. Unfortunately, I was going to play a sound, but you can look this up online. The sound of the Katyusha rocket launcher is very distinctive. You'll know it when you hear it. But it was designed to strike terror in the hearts and minds of the people who were on the receiving end of the Katyushas. They were usually mounted on trucks. They were highly mobile. You can see these particular Katyushas in this image are on trucks. A strategy known as shoot and scoot. So you would fire the rockets and reposition the trucks so as not to be hit by return artillery fire. Jokingly, half-jokingly, they were called Stalin's organs, the sound that they made. Soviet weaknesses in 1941 in terms of leadership. Stalin himself was not a great military mind, but believed himself, of course, to be. And for the first 2 weeks of the war, Stalin went into this kind of funk, this depression and seclusion, borderline suicidal. He couldn't believe that he had made this agreement with Hitler, and Hitler backed out of the agreement and still invaded him, and kind of probably second-guessing himself for being so naive or so trusting. Another leadership issue for the Soviets is their military. During the Great Purge, 1937, veteran officers were killed and exiled. Junior officers who took their places were inexperienced, and in some cases were just party hacks with no real military training. The Soviet Air Force was something of a weakness in 1941. Although they were trying to catch up, their Air Force was somewhat outdated and couldn't match the Germans in terms of technological capabilities. They did have a lot of planes, but many of them were inferior. I'll leave this slide up for a couple of extra seconds. By the numbers, Operation Barbarossa, you can see that the Soviets had a distinct advantage in the number of divisions. So certainly in manpower, they outnumbered the Germans. Decisive advantage in tanks, although not all of these were T-34s at the time. Germans with a significant bomber and fighter advantage, especially in terms of technology. Their aircraft at this point were much superior to anything the Soviets had. Big advantage in artillery. However, again, the Soviet Union could draw on much larger population reserves and in a greater territorial sphere. The Operation Barbarossa really consisted of 3 main goals at the earliest stages of the invasion: to capture Leningrad, Moscow, and the city of Kiev in the Ukraine. On June 22nd of 1941, Germany invaded Russia with a total troop strength of about 4 million men. This was the biggest single land operation ever. By the end of July, the Germans had gained an area of Russia 2 times the size of France. One of the techniques they used was this Keil und Kessel strategy, or wedge and kettle strategy. The Keil is the wedge where the army drives tanks and armored vehicles into the enemy mass. The kettle are the infantry units that encircle the cut mass and drive the enemy into a kettle-shaped trap. In part, this was an intelligence failure, not because of that the signs weren't there. The Soviets just weren't listening, especially at the top. Stalin just disregarded information from the best U.S. and British intelligence sources, who told him almost to the day when the invasion was coming and where it was coming, but he chose to ignore it. Russians call this the Great Patriotic War. because Stalin was able to set aside political ideology and tap into Russian nationalism in the purposes of defeating the invading Germans. This map shows the development of the invasion known as Operation Barbarossa. You had Army Group North to the north, that's the northernmost you can see on here. Something like 29 divisions, 570 tanks, focused on the Baltic and Leningrad regions. The general in charge of Army Group North, Lieb, was somewhat anti-Nazi. Hitler had forced him to retire several times. He managed to drive initially 560 miles into the Soviet Union and surrounded Leningrad, but Hitler was very impatient and wanted it to be taken more quickly. Army Group Center, with the goals of Smolensk and Moscow, about 49 divisions, maybe 900 tanks, led by General von Bock, who was not a brilliant theoretician but was very determined and strong-willed. He was not a Nazi either. He was a monarchist, and but he managed to stay out of the anti-Hitler assassination plots. Hitler had a fair amount of respect for von Bock and tolerated his outspokenness. And for von Bock, there was no greater glory than to die for the fatherland. The German troops, however, referred to him as der Sturber, as the dying one, because of his very grim outlook. Finally, Army Group South, led by General von Rundstedt, who was an aristocratic Prussian origin. The goals there were Kiev and the Caucasus region, the oil-producing regions. 42 divisions he possessed, maybe about 700 tanks. He, like many of his generals, was fired and rehired several times by Hitler. At one point, he suffered a heart attack during Barbarossa, but stayed on the job. He strongly opposed the advance into the Soviet Union during winter. He advised Hitler to halt the offensive, but Hitler failed to listen. So Hitler focused on Moscow for traditional reasons, capturing the capital of his enemy. He assumed Stalin's regime was about to collapse. He ordered an advance on Moscow before winter. However, the Germans had serious supply shortages. By September, the supply system was only meeting their current tactical consumption needs. There were no supply stores for the winter season that were being built up. In the attack on Moscow, the Germans caught the Russians unprepared. They made rapid advances. It seemed as though the Soviet army was on the verge of collapse. But then the weather broke, and autumn rains turned roads to mud. The German advance stalled, allowing the Russians to hurry reinforcements in from the interior. Then cold hit, but despite the dropping temperatures and critical supply shortages, German high command pushed the attack. German soldiers still had their summer uniforms and suffered terribly. You have an image here of a frost-bitten German soldier during the Battle of Moscow. By December 4th, the Germans had clawed their way to the outskirts of Moscow but could not continue. That night, the temperatures fell to 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. One infantry regiment suffered 300 frostbite casualties. And on December 6th, the Soviets counterattacked. Let's turn north now to Leningrad, the former capital of Russia. Was the home of the Russian Revolution and the base of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. During the siege of Leningrad, for 3 years, all land routes into the city were blocked. Civilians, however, had not been evacuated. In fact, they ran the risk of being shot if they tried to leave the city. There was but one road in and out of Leningrad at this time. It was called the Road of Life. Crossed Lake Ladoga. We'll see that on a map in a second. Initially, the Germans allied with the Finns. There were 120 miles of timber barricades, some 395 miles of wire entanglements, 430 miles of anti-tank ditches that the Soviets set up, and as many as 16,000 miles of trenches were excavated by the civilians of. Over the course of the attack on Leningrad, some 641,000 Russians died of starvation. As best as possible, supplies were shipped across Lake Ladoga and via airdrops. This was something like a 900-day siege of the city of Leningrad. In the winter of 41 and 42, rations were down to 50 grams of bread per person per day. If you don't know your metrics, 29 grams to the ounce, that's less than 2 ounces of bread. One paperclip weighs 1 gram, to give you more perspective. And of that bread, and I put that in quotes, 60% of it was made of sawdust. So civilians were forced to eat leather, to eat wallpaper paste. There were cases of cannibalism. The city was utterly destroyed. Perhaps as many as 1 million Red Army were killed, became POWs, or were missing in action. Over 1 million civilian deaths. One cemetery alone in Leningrad, Piskaryovskoye, holds 500,000 civilian victims. Back in Moscow, Rundstedt, the German commander of Army Group South, ordered retreat, and Hitler responded by firing Rundstedt. Walter von Reichenau replaced Rundstedt, confirmed that withdrawal order. Then, in the middle of this, suffered his own heart attack, so Hitler was stuck with a really severe high command crisis, and he had no faith in his own generals. On December 7th of 1941, as you know, Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. In spite of his troubles in Russia, Hitler decided to support Japan and also declare war on the United States. This forced the United States to join with Britain to adopt this Europe First strategy to destroy Hitler. As the Russians pushed forward, Hitler refused retreat. He relieved or court-martialed any generals who did retreat. He named himself commander-in-chief of the army, and each military branch became increasingly independent, so the Germans suffered from an overall lack of strategy at this time. Generals were more concerned about their own political survival than they were about winning the war in some cases. During this harsh winter in the Soviet Union, German resistance, control of roads, and supply centers took the punch out of the Russian counterattack. The German army did survive, but the losses from which it received, they never fully recovered. Both sides regrouped and prepared for the spring. Hitler then turned his attention southward. This was strategically not a smart move. Hitler thought the Germans had to destroy the Soviet military before the American industry could gear up. He wanted to capture Soviet oil, and Stalingrad does have some connection to the oil-producing regions of the Caucasus. Strategically, Stalingrad's of little importance, but he thought that perhaps the capture of Stalingrad would block the movement of oil up from the Volga River. But really, this was more about the fact that his chief enemy, Joseph Stalin, had a city named after him. It was something of an industrial center, but this is more of a morale boost for the Germans than anything else. On June 28th of 1942, the Germans launched their summer offensive. They made headway with one advance east to Stalingrad and the Volga River, and another south to the Caucasus. And Hitler has, I've heard said, Hitler might have been ADD or ADHD. He had this sort of erratic shift in attention back and forth between the Caucasus and Stalingrad, so lacking that firm decisiveness that is needed in times of war. This map shows the situation in 1942 in southwestern Russia, near Stalingrad and the Caucasus region. In the attack on Stalingrad on the 24th of August, the Germans attacked the suburbs of Stalingrad, began fighting their way into the city. Hitler shifted forces again from the Caucasus to Stalingrad. Urban fighting, though, favors defenders typically, and Stalingrad had took significant tolls on the German army, but Hitler was very stubborn and wanted to win at all costs at Stalingrad. The Germans called this the Rattenkrieg, or the Rat War. The Germans bitterly joked about capturing the kitchen, but still fighting for the living room and the bedroom. The Soviets made great use of snipers, well fortified and hidden machine gun nests. It was very difficult to know exactly who was the enemy in Stalingrad, but this is the case in many house-to-house and close-quarter fighting. We saw that, the United States saw that in the Iraq War in some of the battles in places like Fallujah. Very difficult to know who the enemy is. One example of this phenomenon is what was known as Pavlov's house. It was a fortified apartment building. You can see an image of it here. From the 27th of September through the 25th of November 1942, they held out and killed countless Germans. It's named after a Soviet sergeant named Yakov Pavlov, who commanded a platoon. It became a symbol of the stubborn resistance of the Soviets. It had a significant strategic use. It was positioned on a cross street that gave the defenders a 1-kilometer line of sight to the north, south, and west, so they could see the Germans long before the Germans could see them. The building was surrounded with 4 layers of barbed wire and minefields. It had machine gun posts in every window. And at one time, they mounted an anti-tank gun on the roof to ambush tanks, which blew right through the thin turret roof armor. Typically, tanks, of course, modern tanks, armor designs have taken this into account, but at the time they didn't think about direct shots coming down on top of the tank. German tanks, unfortunately, were unable to elevate their weapons at the right angle or high enough to be able to take out this building. One German general said that one Russian general said that more Germans died trying to capture Pavlov's house than died trying to capture Paris. A quote from Adolf Hitler: "You may rest assured that nobody will ever drive us out of Stalingrad," trying to build up support for the troops who had stalled in Stalingrad. General Paulus asked for reinforcements. He needed more tanks, he needed more engineers, he needed more infantry. A few worked their way in there. By October 19th, he controlled 90% of the city. He launched a last offensive despite very few supplies, but the Red Army repelled the attack. The Germans stood their ground but suffered very high losses. On November 19th, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack north of Stalingrad. Hitler's overly centralized and out-of-touch command system broke down in the Soviet onslaught. The Soviets ended up encircling Stalingrad. Hitler ordered his commanders to stand fast. By this point, though, no officers would oppose Hitler, at least directly. The Germans were surrounded. Hitler ordered resupply by air. The Luftwaffe was dropping about 3,000 tons a day of materials to an army that needed 5,000 just to stay current, to meet their current needs. And of this 3,000 tons, a significant portion wound up in Soviet hands. Attempts to break out or break through failed, and on the 2nd of February 1943, the Germans surrendered. Out of 250,000 soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, in this pocket, about 90,000 became prisoners, and of this 90,000, only 5,000 survived the war to return back to Germany. There are a number of reasons for the failure of Operation Barbarossa. Certainly logistical shortcomings made this a doomed operation. Germany was capable of fighting battles well, but less capable of a prolonged war. After 4 years, 4 million Axis forces and 9 million Russians were killed in battle, and yet the Soviets seemingly could resupply almost at will. 20 million Soviet citizens were killed in extermination campaigns against Jews, communists, partisans, plus casual massacres, reprisals, killings, and sometimes planned starvation. Hitler shares a significant amount of the blame for the failure of Operation Barbarossa. His impulsiveness, his decisions to fire key personnel. The Soviets should get some credit for the failure of Operation Barbarossa. They had, as we discussed earlier, some technological advantages. Stalin was able to tap into nascent or latent Russian nationalism and sort of put the revolution aside during the war. and effectively marshaled public sentiments against the Germans.